the food system. Please adjust the volume on your device to ensure that you can hear my voice as you view the PowerPoint slide. Let's get started. There are several learning objectives for this lesson. By the end of this lecture, students will be able to define food politics and food justice, understand the communicative elements that make up the global food system, explain how food justice operates as a new system of communication, and critically consider their own participation in the food system. Let's get on with the lecture. If you're anything like me, you probably start your day off with a cup of coffee. Actually, if you're like me, it's probably more than just a cup. But it's a pretty simple thing, getting coffee, right? Whether you buy it from the store and make it at home, or go to a coffee shop or bakery where they make it for you, and you drink it, it's a pretty innocuous action, isn't it? It doesn't actually mean much to drink that cup of coffee. But consider what it took to get that coffee to you. Here's how Raj Patel explains the process as experienced by Lawrence, a farmer in Uganda who grows coffee used by Nestle. Lawrence and his family live in an area well suited to coffee. It's high-altitude, hilly terrain. This means that their land is unsuited to do anything else. The choice that faces them is this: grow coffee or leave. With little else to go to, they grow coffee. They sell to a local middleman at around 14 cents per kilo, who then takes the bag to the mill and sells it for 19 cents. The mill will process it for an additional 5 cents per kilo, which is barely enough to keep the mill going. The coffee is bagged and, with a 2 cent per kilo freight cost, sent to Kampala, another part of Uganda, by which time the price has reached 26 cents. One of the larger Ugandan coffee exporters is happy to be making a profit of $10 US per ton, or 1 cent on the kilo. And that's for quality coffee. There are different grades of coffee, you know. Yet he transports them, and by the time this 1 kilo of coffee lands in, say, West London, where Nestle has a coffee processing facility, it'll cost US $1.64 per kilo. Already at the gates of the Nescafe factory, the cost per bag is well over 10 times what the farmers receive for it. But here comes the big jump. By the time the coffee rolls out on the other side, the price is $26.40 per kilo, or nearly 200 times the cost of a kilo in Uganda. And while coffee farmers are living off of their savings, Nestle's profits seem unstoppable. In 2005, they sold over $70 billion US in food and beverages. So that was an excerpt from Raj Patel's book, Stuffed and Starved, and he described the process by which coffee is made. And what's interesting to me is that that whole process is in my cup of coffee. By purchasing that coffee and drinking that coffee, I become part of that system. My body becomes part of that system. I'm drinking that system. And yet it's hidden to me when I see the fancy labels naming exotic countries where coffee is grown, and perhaps even if I see a fair trade certified label on the coffee bag. Lawrence and I, that farmer in the story, are connected through a complex supply chain. And yet the disparities in power, access, and resources between my experience in the grocery store buying that product and his experience growing it are completely hidden. That story about the coffee process demonstrates issues of politics and justice in the food system. But let's first unpack what both of those concepts mean. I think for most of us, when we hear the word politics, we tend to associate it with things like government, elections, things we perhaps learned in a civics class, law, and people who hold political office like elected officials. But the Oxford English Dictionary actually tells us that politics is about debate or conflict among individuals or parties having or hoping to achieve power. So our initial assumptions are correct. There is indeed considerable power among government officials. For example, I don't get to create policies or pass bills. Other people have that power. And isn't it a large part of getting elected about having the power to outwit your opponent and persuade voters your way? But I also want you to begin thinking about other instances where politics come into play, where power is happening. This definition then tells us that there's more to politics than what we initially assumed. Politics refers to a set of beliefs, values, and assumptions that are concerned with status or position and influencing others. So we can see there is a set of politics at play, for example, when groups like Utah Moms for Clean Air make statements about air quality in the Salt Lake Valley. Because they are doing particular activities like press conferences, research studies, and even protests to demonstrate their belief that something must be done about the winter inversions and health impacts, and they want to influence policymakers. So what about this idea of justice? When most of us hear that word, it is probably in the context of the judicial system. We hear a lawyer saying, "I want justice for the victims of the crime," or something like that. But the bigger picture there is issues of fairness, good reason, and equality. That is why, for example, we had a movement like women's suffrage here in the United States that ended up with a constitutional amendment that made it a legal right for women to vote. It was considered unfair, inequitable, and an injustice to deny that right to women. Now we can begin to see how politics and justice figure into a system of communication, how our words and actions, even everyday practices, influence and communicate social status and can demonstrate fairness and equity. So let's think about what makes up our modern-day food system. Marion Nestle wrote the book Food Politics. You can see the cover image right here in the slide. And it's one of the foremost exposés of the complexities of the modern food system. She used to work for the USDA many years ago, and she has a background in nutrition, so she's an expert on these issues. She characterizes the food system simply as, quote, the food industry. Other advocates have chosen different phrases. For example, Eric Holt Jimenez, executive director of Food First, prefers the more militaristic term, the agro-industrial complex. I depicted this system visually with the network of brand names included in the first slide of this presentation. What all of this refers to is the conglomerate of entities that make up our global food system. Importantly, this global system is more than just the companies or corporations that manufacture food items. From seed to plate, as they say, this system is totally comprehensive. It includes all the steps it took to get those coffee beans from Lawrence's farm in Uganda to the grocery stores in West London in that story from Patel's book. Things like farming contracts, manufacturing processes, distribution and transportation, advertising practices, nutrition recommendations, legislators creating policies, and even you, the consumer, are all part of this food system, that food industry, as Nestle calls it. As a student taking a course in communication and social responsibility, you can begin to see this system is made up of so many different parties all vying for influence, profit, and attention. You can see that this system is built on a network of interactions. Indeed, the food system is socially constructed through communication between entities within the food industry, including us, the consumers. Whether it is an advertisement persuading us to purchase a particular product, or nutritional advice that recommends limiting sodium or sugar, or a federal policy that provides incentives for farmers to grow particular crops like soy or corn, or even food traditions and systems of socialization that tell us how and when and what is appropriate to eat, we are caught in a constant flow of messages about food that sometimes can make it hard to tread water. With all of these food entities vying for influence and attention, the food system is rife with politics. It is telling that there are only about 10 major companies running the global food system today, while the world's poorest populations have the responsibility of feeding the world. It is no surprise then that companies like Coca-Cola sponsor major sporting events and even offer scholarships to maintain market dominance and a good corporate image. But there's an essential tension at play in this food system, and I think Nestle eloquently lays it out when she says, quote, food is required for life. Of course, we all have to eat, right? But she also tells us the primary mission of food companies is to sell products, end quote. That's why among food companies, policymakers, and the media, there is a constant struggle for power and influence. And customers play a role in this too, because we have what's called purchasing power, right? Or do we? I mentioned Coca-Cola a moment ago. Did you know, for example, that they have the power to negotiate exclusive contracts with universities so that competitors' products can't be sold on college campuses? So is it really purchasing power, for example, when you have to choose between a Diet Coke and Dasani bottled water? In response to many of the issues raised by Nestle, many community-level advocates and organizations have begun emphasizing food justice because they feel that the politics of the food system tend to overshadow issues of justice, creating inequality and disparities across groups of people. For example, for many people living below the poverty line, it can be possible to be both stuffed and starved. This is the phrase Raj Patel uses to describe the experience of those who have no deficit of caloric value. In this sense, they are getting enough to eat, and yet they significantly lack nutrient value. This is often the case for those living in a food desert, an area defined by a lack of access to full-service grocery stores, yet will have an abundance of fast food chains, convenience stores, and liquor stores. These kinds of disparities, as well as others faced by farm workers, animals raised on factory farms, and people on food assistance, are unjust. They are evidence of a food system that lacks equity in its practices, as it unfairly impacts some groups over others. Food justice, then, as Gottlieb and Joshi in their book, Food Justice, you can see the cover here, tell us that the idea of food justice operates as a specific mode of awareness and advocacy that ensures that the benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown and produced, transported and distributed, and accessed and eaten are shared fairly. And just as we discovered how the food system is built on interactions, food justice is also a communicative tool that challenges, questions, and seeks to reconfigure the power regime of the food system. As you can see in their definition here on the slide, food justice seeks to establish a language and set of meanings that illuminates how food injustices are experienced and how they can be challenged and overcome. So they have placed this concept of food justice squarely within the realm of communication. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, politics and justice are both driven by communication. And in the food system, they operate as two sides of the same coin. Remember, we consumers are part of this food system too, and we make decisions every day that keep that system operating in particular ways. It is important that we use critical thinking, fair-minded thinking, and social responsibility to consider and question how and why some food items are preferred over others. For example, why are processed foods cheaper than fresh produce? How nutrition professionals define health and make their recommendations. Who has access to food and to what kinds of food? As well as our personal lifestyles and needs that enable and constrain us in particular ways. For example, do you know how to cook? Do you have time to cook your own meals? I urge you to consider how the food system impacts you, as well as your role in participating in it. Think about those supply chains hidden in the foods you consume. Consider what influences your food choices and why particular commitments are important for you. Thank you.